Good evening. I almost said good morning. How many of you have said good morning? Yes. It's a hard habit to break when you've been doing something the same way for a very, very long time. First, I want to welcome you if you're a first-time guest to One Church. We have gone through a lot of change and transition lately, so this is the first time in our new space. And technically, this is my first day on the job as lead pastor. So if you're... Thank you. So if you're brave enough to stick around to see what's next, we would love to have you here. My name is Angie Von Slaughter, in case I didn't mention that. And here at One Church, our sole purpose really is to aim to be a safe community that expresses the love, the inclusive love of God. And because of that, things might look and feel very differently from week to week. You might have one service that feels one way and one that's totally different because everybody here is so unique and different. I guarantee if you took us out to dinner, we'd all have very different views on this thing we call God, the divine Lord, Spirit, Creator. And yet we hold space and tension in this place for people that have questions and doubts, including ourselves. And that's one of my favorite things about this community is the diversity, the inclusivity, I can't even find the word, the love that is in this place. So I hope that you find that as well. So we're settling into this new space here, obviously. If you've been here before or if this is your first time, some of you may have found straight away that you fell in love with the building. You loved the space. It felt warm. It felt inviting. It was expansive. Some of you may have picked up on the rainbow flecks behind the cross. Don't know if that was intentional, but I love it. And the gorgeous wooden ceiling. And some of you just may have instantly felt at home. And yet I recognize some of you walked into this place and may have felt a little uncomfortable. Because this is probably one of the first times, our last church that we met at was the first time that One Church has been in a church. We've been mainly in schools and theaters and homes. So we went to a church, a trampoline park. We did that for a while. And we got tired of jumping up and down. So we moved to a church. And then now we're actually in a church. Like the other space we were in more modern, and this is a church. And I recognize for some of you, it's an adjustment, and it might make you feel a little uncomfortable. And I mean, when's the last time any of you have sat in pews? Right? Preach. So for me, the last time, it was actually most of my childhood, and I grew up on pews. So for myself, I had to process, what does it look like to be in a space with pews? And I know it's just a chair, but there's a lot of symbolism there. And so for myself, I remember distinctly being a kid, and my sister and I would often get separated from one another because we'd get the giggles every time, and my dad was not having it. He'd break us up, and be like, Angie, you're over here, Jess, you're over there, shut up. We'd try to be quiet, and we couldn't, and I'd get bored, like you do when you're a kid, trying to pay attention in service, and I eventually would just kind of slink my way down and slide under the pew. Right? Have you guys ever done that? And I hid under the pew and I'd play with my toys and all the old sticky gum under the chair. And as funny as that is, in the same breath, I also remember the loud words of hellfire and brimstone going in the background. And I also remember the really intense, I didn't understand half of what was being said, but I felt it. Do you know what I'm talking about? And I felt it, such heavy imagery. And so for me, that space under the pew was actually a really good hiding space. It was a place to occupy my time and hide. So I understand that for some of you, there's tension in this space. And so we hold space for that, and we acknowledge it. There's a lot of psychology behind pews, platforms, and pulpits. And in ancient times, the earliest churches didn't have pews. We didn't even have seating. There's no evidence to prove that. We often stood. And it involved maybe someone talking for a little bit, and we stood, but it really involved more of a liturgical practice, a worship practice, something we did communally together. And as the evolution of church turned on, chairs were introduced, but they were movable. People could kind of come, scoot up a chair for a little bit, mingle about. It was still a little bit casual. And then the Protestant Reformation happened, and it changed everything. And the way church was structured became less and less, not in all churches, but less and less about that practice we do together, but about the sermon. And long sermons, might I add, 3, 4, 5, 6 hours. So you can imagine why you need a pew, right? After all of that listening, you need some place to plant yourself so you don't get tired. The thing that's interesting is the first pew was born, and they were really box pews, and they're more of like a luxury style pew that really looked, you can see an example, there's one, and it's interesting. It was sort of like this caged-in, boxed-in space, and the ironic thing about it is they were often bought and owned and ordered by the congregation's wealthiest participants and families. So they would come and spend all their money and have this super ornate pew all to hear the altruistic teachings of Jesus, which is kind of ironic. And having purchased one of these was like a status symbol. Like, have you checked out my pew? So cool, right? It was this thing. It was a big deal. And a lot of them had carvings on them. You see ornate pictures, and oftentimes it depicted either the history or even the family. So they might have even had paintings or carvings of the time, and then a lot of them had their names on them as a symbol of this is clearly reserved. This is mine. I purchased it. And even so far as, this was something that had a deed. It was like real estate. You could pass it down into your family, a pew. Does anyone want to purchase one of these? Anybody? And with heavy planks of wood bolted in the ground, pews have become, for some, and not all, but for some, a symbol of antiquated and immovable theology. And yet, at its function, it's a glorified bench. Let's be honest. You need a place to sit. And so at its symbolism, it can be redefined. And there's one thing I know about One Church is we do that really, really well. We are a resilient community. We are a community that finds ourselves in unusual spaces, unusual conversations, and we're able to redefine, what does that mean for me? What does that mean for us? And when I look at these pews, I'm like, those pews that I'm looking at, these pews aren't those pews. And when I look at these people aren't those people. And that, for me, makes me go, okay, we can sit in pews together, side by side. Jackie mentioned something last week that said, home is where the heart is. And I do believe she even said, welcome home. And I couldn't have said it any better, that we are home. Because honestly, if we met in a gym, I would be okay with that. If we met in a library, I'd be okay with that. If we met outside, as long as it wasn't 110, I'd be okay with that. Because this is our community, and I was about to say life together, but that is such an overused statement. But we love one another. We love one another. And so as we settle into and get acquainted with our new home, honestly, it's my desire that we redefine some of these symbols and icons. Some of these things we're dragging along from our past. Maybe we can redefine them together. And I also want you to know, just in case you're like, well, what kind of space is this that we're in? In meeting with the pastor of Mission del Sol, Pastor David, he is a really sweet and gentle guy. He said that the one hope he had for this sanctuary, that it would be a space of extravagant welcome. And he said it again and again, a safe place for extravagant welcome. And I thought, wouldn't that be great for us to join in on that statement and embody that and say, yeah, this is a safe space for extravagant welcome. And so this evening, as we're exploring the sacred spaces that we inhabit, because our surroundings really do shape our experiences, I figured we might as well talk about it a little bit more, because they do matter. They affect us. Churches, synagogues, stupas, temples, mosques, all around the world, humans, for centuries, since the beginning of time, have been creating spaces of worship, continually, again and again. Stonehenge, the Parthenon, shrines to Apollo and Poseidon, the Sistine Chapel. The list goes on and on and on. We've been doing this for centuries. And humankind has been setting holy intentions through sacred architecture. That's all with one purpose in mind. And that purpose is to bring us closer to the divine. Ancient temples were viewed as the dwelling place of the gods and were spaces used for sacrificial ceremonies. And they were often exclusive, private, and reserved only for a few select individuals. And such is the case during the days of the Apostle Paul. So we're going to bring in a biblical story real quick, and you're going to go, well, how in the world does this apply? It does. Trust me, I read this and went, yeah, you might as well just fill in today's world, and it's pretty much the same. In the New Testament, we find in the book of 1 Corinthians, which is a letter that Paul wrote to a church he founded in Corinth. And it's this seedy port town, heavy with a transient population because it's a port town. People are coming in and out. So it's really cultured, a lot of different things going on. And it's located in south central Greece. And during the classical period in Greece, the city of Corinth, they had created and erected this temple as a shrine to Aphrodite, who's the god of love. And as a way of honoring her, they basically gave her sacrifice by employing thousands and thousands of sex workers. And that was what they called love. Interesting how we do that today. So much so that the word Corinthian was a slang term. So it was more than just you're a Corinthian, like, oh, you're a Phoenician, you're from Phoenix. When you called someone a Corinthian, that had weight. Like, Athena, are you seriously going to go out looking like that? You look like such a Corinthian. Like that kind of weight. Are you picking up what I'm putting down? It had a lot attached to that word. And the Greek way of living had a strong, strong influence on the Roman Empire. And truthfully, so much of Western civilization, even today. We get a lot of our political structures, literature, art, poetry, philosophy from this period in Greek history. And so just as it's influenced our present day, it's also influenced this time in Paul's era as he's in this city of Corinth. And Corinth was a city of luxury. So we say it's a seedy port town, people coming in and out. We get this view of it's scummy, but really it's scummy, but it's glamorous. So if you can kind of get your mind on maybe more like Hollywood, the underbelly of some of our American cities, where it's rich and full of money, but it's also got this seedy part that maybe we don't really want to talk about. That's the kind of city that we're talking about. So it was well known for its entertainment, which is why I liken it to Hollywood or maybe Vegas, as well as its elaborate temples built to honor the gods. And so Paul chose this location specifically, as you can see, to start a place to spread the teachings of Jesus. He clearly saw a space that was like, we might need to talk about what love really looks like. We might need to talk about what this means. And fast forward time, Paul gets reports and he's hearing that this church he founded isn't doing so well. And they had a few different teachers and leaders in the church. And the people in the church start bickering back and forth, basically taking sides with who these leaders are. This is a bad example because I know you both love me and Aaron, but it would have been like, well, Team Angie, Team Aaron, team that back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Such division, and that's just a mild example, but there was lots of bickering and fighting. And so we read in 1 Corinthians 3, 1-7, Paul's words to the community in Corinth. Brothers and sisters, I could not address you as people who live by the Spirit, but as people who are still worldly, mere infants in Christ. I gave you milk, not solid food, for you were not ready for it. Indeed, you are still not ready. You are still worldly. For since there is jealousy and quarreling among you, are you not worldly? Are you not acting like mere humans? For when one says, I follow Paul, and the other says, I follow Apollos, are you not mere human beings? What, after all, is Apollos? And what is Paul? Only servants, through whom you came to believe, as the Lord has assigned to each his task. I planted the seed, Apollos watered it, but God has been making it grow. So neither the one who plants nor the one who waters is anything, but only God who makes things grow. And so we get this look, so this is a little snapshot at Paul's letter to them, and we get this little view that Paul is addressing all kinds of things here, their lifestyle, their quarreling, and the way they view their leadership as near godlike. And so he's diving into these things one by one. And Paul, being the outspoken guy he was, didn't hold back and called them babies, pretty much, like, you're mere infants, you babies. And he's saying, basically, like, get over it, quit your whining, why are you fighting with each other? What's happening? This is not why I started this place in the first place. I started it so we could follow a way of love, a different path, and here we are bickering. And he's trying to get them to see that this isn't the way the church was supposed to be. The Corinthians had become fixated on their teachers, on correct theology, the formalities of their sacred spaces, who could come into their sacred spaces, rather than the reason for the meetings in the first place. And we've never heard a narrative like that in Christianity before, have we? Ever? You read this and you go, yes, wow, us humans haven't learned a lot. We're still doing the exact same thing. Well, I'm Baptist. Well, I'm Lutheran. Well, I'm evangelical. Well, I'm this. Well, I'm that. And it's this back and forth, back and forth. But then Paul says something that's fascinating. And in verse 16, so if we fast forward, he says, don't you know that you are God's temple, and that God's Spirit dwells in the midst of you? Now he makes a statement that really is clear. It's a super clear statement, but it's really unheard of for this time. Because temples weren't people. Temples were actual brick and mortar places you walked into. And so he's making a statement that they are the temple, that they are the sacred space in whom the Spirit of God lives and breathes. Not the theology, not the leadership, not the temple. And when Paul uses the word for temple, he's making a huge statement here. The temple he's referring to is an actual brick and mortar location. The temple was located in Jerusalem. It was a large structure with beautiful and ornate sacred architecture, and we actually have an image for you to get a look at. This is a 3D rendering of what the temple would have looked like at that time. And some version of this temple would have been there for over 1,000 years. And it had been built and rebuilt and built and rebuilt. But it would have been that centerpiece for this city. And all of Jewish life would have been centered around the temple. So everything encompassing culture, government, religion, your whole entire life. And some of us can go, oh, I can relate. Well, I grew up in church, felt that way. It was like everything we did was a part of this temple. And really, it's hard for us to understand because we now live in a time where it's separation from church and state. So we try to do things differently. So it's hard for us to get, but this would have been like a national monument, but a church all at the same time. So it would have been sort of like, let's go to church at the White House. It had that kind of weight. Like, this is the place that tells you, and everybody's like, please, let's not go there. It would have had that kind of thing. This is the place that tells us how to live. This is the place where we experience the divine. It would have been all of that encompassed in one. And that's what I find so interesting is when people say that the Bible isn't biblical, I pause and I go, oh, or not biblical. When there are those people that say that too. People say that the Bible isn't political. I pause and I think, yeah, it's very political, actually. Extremely political. And I'm not about to dive into the politics in case some of you are squirming in your seats. But it's extremely political because that's how life was. Everything they did was intertwined. And us in this world tend to partition things, but then it was a very whole, all-encompassing life. So it was like the White House, but shrouded in steep religion. And I know many would say that wasn't the case, that the Bible isn't political, but we saw kings and kingdoms and armies and reign and rule, laws and the politically charged religion. And this doesn't mean that it should be used, however, in case you're getting any ideas, it doesn't mean the Bible should be used for persuasion or political propaganda. That's a nugget I'll leave alone. But I think that it's a sacred text that should be treated as such. And this gives us insight. If we take this stance, this gives us insight on what ancient history was like. And it helps us sort through the deeper meanings of these stories. And it's important that we get that so we can understand the backstory of what are they talking about, what's going on at this time. And this was a way of life for them back then. Our human space and our sacred space, they overlapped. Temples and shrines, they often provided meaning, and they were spaces where they could meet with the divine spirit. It's a way of acknowledging that something more, right? So Israelites created temples to keep heaven and earth united. And this is an interesting thing. I talked a couple weeks ago about the concept of original blessing. And what's fascinating is really the temples were created as a way to get back to that original blessing. A lot of times temples were ornate and filled with incense and gold, and a lot of temples even had garden imagery. They were trying to recreate the garden. This is the place I was whole. This is the place where I was good. And I find it so fascinating when we peel away this history of we've been doing this throughout time to get back into complete union with our Creator. And whether that's sacrificing to gods in animal form or sacrificing to God in worship and prayer form. We've been doing this since the beginning of time. Now, because this was such a sacred space, only a few select could enter. And Jerusalem was so zealous about keeping the temple pure that they placed stones along the outside fence. So they placed these stones on the edges that basically had inscribed on them threats, death threats to the Gentiles. Basically, enter in and we're going to kill you. We wanted to keep it refined, sacred, pure. So nobody in here knows what that's like, do you? Maybe not a death threat. But we do understand what it's like to be like, this is our space. You can't come in here. This is our sacred space. We like to keep it that way. You're fine over there, not in here. And there's an interesting teaching in Buddhism that addresses this very thing. And I'm a firm believer that we can follow Scripture but find inspiration in many, many places. And this is one that really resonated with me. There's this thought that basically talks about, it's a philosophy called fingers pointing at the moon. And it's a fascinating thought because it's one that would be like, imagine you're out at night and, matter of fact, let's start here. Did anyone see the full moon the other day? Okay, so this is great. Let's go with it. How many of you saw the full moon and were pointing at it and trying to describe it to somebody? Or how many of you wanted to explain it? You try to get someone on the phone and you're trying to explain and describe what this is like. And so there's this philosophy that says when you are a finger pointing at the moon, be careful that you don't get fixated on the finger pointing at the moon, but rather the moon itself. And I'll break this down for you in case some of you are like, what? I don't get it. Those Buddhists, they like to make us think. So see, our sacred spaces and our icons and imagery, everything we see around us, they're fingers pointing to the moon. I see a few heads getting it. They are sacred spaces, they're not the sacred. Now I'm hearing a few more people getting it. So we fixate on our certain pastors, we fixate on our certain theology, our certain language, our certain ideas. See, look. And we get very nearsighted. And we start to say, well, this is the way. This is the only way I've ever encountered God, right here. That we forget to look at what is the language that we're using to describe God. We're describing God. It's not the language. It's not the practice. It's what we're trying to get to. Does that make sense? And so we can a lot of times get stuck, just like humanity did in the church of Corinth, of this bickering and fighting over fingers pointing at the moon. It's not even the moon. we're bickering and fighting over the fingers. And we're missing the thing. The thing is somewhere expansive, far greater than we could even describe, and we try to put language to it, and our words fall short, but we try, and we oftentimes get stuck there. Lutheran theologian and philosopher Paul Tillich, he says something that really struck with me. He believes that religious language is best understood as symbolic, and I think when we can hang on that, it's so helpful. He says, every symbol points beyond itself to a reality for which it stands. I'll say that again. Every symbol points beyond itself to a reality for which it understands. So we have the Lutheran theologian and the Buddhist philosopher, and they're coming to the exact same conclusion, which is, I am just sitting here trying to point to the moon. With my sacred spaces, my imagery, the cross in the background, the pews, no pews, this pastor, that pastor, we're all doing things in our own way, in our own language that we can understand. And those are just things pointing to the mystery of the moon. And then Paul says, which is the best line, don't you know that you are God's temple? When we can grasp that this is all good, this is great, this is wonderful, but this is the temple. This is the temple. And if we understand that the temple then was a place for government, then Paul is really making a statement that says, you govern your own body. You govern your own body, mind, and spirit. And if the temple was exclusive and only certain people could enter, Paul is making a much, much larger and scandalous statement by saying, you can enter because you already have within. And that is like, he might as well have just thrown a grenade at them, because that is such explosive terminology of, you know what, we do all these things and these are beautiful, they're not bad. But this, it's in here. And when we embrace that we are sacred temples, it really also changes the way we treat our bodies. It changes the way we treat the bodies of others. And when we embrace that we are sacred temples, it removes, which I think is something really good and important to take note of, it removes the gatekeepers to our spirituality, which is big. Because some of you have been taught that the only way to the divine is through the temple, and through the temple a certain way. You have to believe a certain way, act a certain way, and I realize I'm using a word that some of you, I keep using the word temple because this is what it is, and some of you actually came from temples. And so it rings true even further. But the temple is just a space. The temple is in here. The temple is in here. And when we know that, we understand the end of the day, all we're doing in this space is trying to get closer to that something more. And all of this is just a finger pointing to the moon. And so I'll leave you with this. Don't you know that you are God's temple? Don't you know that you are God's temple? That you are a sacred space in whom the Spirit of God lives and breathes and moves. And may we all together seek and search for the mystery that tonight I'll call the moon.